Okay, we'll get started now with session 2. We have session 2 on layout performance, and to moderate this session, we have Mike Shaver from Facebook. Mike, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Excited to be here. So I'll tell you a little bit about the panelists here, and then we'll get started. Charles works on at Flipboard, living the adventure of layout performance in many different browsers. Wilson, developer in Firefox OS and author of a library fast DOM, which gets good performance by avoiding the overhead of actually laying things out. Christopher Shadow on the React team at Facebook, who provides a library that gets good performance by avoiding touching the DOM. David Barron, who works at Mozilla, trying to give us fewer reasons to avoid layout and touching layout in the DOM. And Paul Lewis, developer advocate, tries to help developers make their applications quick and using all the power of the web and in spite, in some cases, of the power of the web. And Paul will get us started with a quick presentation here about layout performance.
Great. What I wanted to do is just start talking about what layout is, just so we framed the conversation a little bit. Layout's the process of converting the DOM and styles to a geometric representation of the page. So it's about getting data concerning width, height, location, and visibility of every element. And for the initial load, so we sort of think of this as the first frame, you need to know everything about every element and its geometry. So you kind of calculate the world, right? But for subsequent frames, you might only change part of the page, like, I don't know, adding more information to something, expanding something, maybe even removing something. And hopefully we'd only recalculate the layout for that smaller part of the tree, or you'd think anyway, but actually most of the time layout is scoped to the entire document. And this is sort of in large parts due to the web's layout model, the document flow that we're all used to. If you change the width of body, then most likely everything inside of that's going to change. And if you change something further down the tree, then its ancestors all the way back up will at least get checked, and if they're affected, then they might get laid out as well. But layout is kind of one part of this whole pipeline, and this being a kind of simplified version, which includes JavaScript, it includes style calculations, painting, and composition. And layout itself is sort of born of CSS, kind of sadly, I think, in some ways, with the classic box model, flex, grid, all these things that we've had over time. Other things about layout, you can't trigger layout without also triggering paint, because as you change the geometry, you'll need to change pixels. So for most cases, today when you trigger layout and therefore paint, you'll probably miss frames. So we basically tell you to avoid it at all costs, or if you're going to do it judiciously so the user doesn't notice. So as such, we've ended up with this kind of fairly intricate relationship with the parts of our pages, and from a layout point of view at least, it's a finely balanced house of cards. We fight with CSS, we fight with layout, both to get good performance, but to avoid brittleness. From the outside, I think layout is really difficult to reason about. If I change the height of this element over here, what happens inside the layout engine? I don't know. I have no idea. Not a clue. Try it and find out. It's exciting, right? And how long should I expect that to take on like a Nexus 5? I don't know. And what about other browsers? You know, you might get something from Chrome, but you might not. And even then, you still got all these other browsers to deal with. So we don't always get the insight that I think we probably need to make good decisions. So from a developer point of view, I think it's just difficult to understand what's going on in the pipeline and what the impact of your code is going to be. So I think that's why, for me, this panel is really important, because for anybody who's serious about building for the web, fast loading and fast running pages are crucial. Especially as things like service worker kick in and loading changes, then the differentiator might actually be how people feel about your app when they're actually using the thing. Because what we're trying to avoid is that judder of missed frames, or worse, a complete halt, because we know it's going to kill the user experience. That's the thing we want to avoid. And for me, I think layout performance is actually a proxy for, I want my stuff to run well, because right now it probably doesn't. And not necessarily layout itself as that little task in the pipeline. So broadening our view a little bit then, we and our users want fast running experiences, and we're sad when we don't get them. But I want to kind of ask, whose problem is that? Allow me to present two extremes of views to that particular question. First of all, it's entirely the browser manufacturer's responsibility. I should just write my code, and they should make sure that it runs well. For me, that would be like telling a car manufacturer that you expect to be able to get to 60 miles an hour, no matter what fuel you put in, how you drive, or what you end up carrying. Just seems on the touch unreasonable side to me, that. On the other extreme, it's entirely the developer's responsibility. Things can perform well, they can go fast, as long as they don't trigger layout or paint. And that, for me, is like the car manufacturer in response telling you you can only change gears at exactly 4,000 RPM, and for the love of all that is decent, we know we've given you a steering wheel, but please don't turn left because the car will explode. So I'm not convinced that that's actually the right question to ask. Who's going to make this faster? I think a better question to ask is, do we even have the right pipeline? And is it optimized for the right thing? To answer that one, I think we're going to do a little bit of armchair philosophy, a sort of philosophy of web development, if you like, to ask the important questions like, what experiences are we trying to make? What's the difference between a web app and a website? And if text is indented by minus 999 EMs and nobody's about to read it, is it truly there? Let's start with the big one, the one that actually I think matters today. What experiences are we actually trying to make? Or put another way, what's the primary use case of the web? Because that, for me, should define our path, the questions we ask ourselves, and crucially, what we optimize for. For context, Android and, of course, iOS as well, both have a very clear single use case for me, apps. Everything is in support of apps and very little else. We, on the other hand, have a platform that's grown out of documents. That's, its origins, right? Headings, sections, articles, the document object model. And we have, sort of fairly funny layout models in some places. But as we try and make web apps, we've realized there's a bit of a mismatch here. We don't have included in our platform app-like primitives, like infinite scrolling list views, or master detail views, and navigation drawers, or pull to refresh, or all the other things that we've heard from that first panel. I'm sure you can build something like those, but it requires significant work, often at the cost of circumventing the browser's models, or re-implementing things like scrolling yourself. To my mind, we've got a few options in ascending order of extremity. One, we can keep improving the web, add a rocket to the back of the car, in the hope that our entire pipeline will eventually become fast enough for us to do what it is we want. And the good news there is that there are significant improvements happening in all the browsers. Streamlining of style calculations, layout itself, GPU rasterization, or fixes to touch input latency. But is that enough? Is that going to get us there? Two, we could keep polishing but add in new hooks and new primitives to better equip the pipeline for web apps, assuming that's what we want to do. What about hooks into the layout engine that let you decide what gets laid out when and how? Or if you want something, some kind of progressive layout or something like that, sort of lo-fi, hi-fi, what do we do to the pipeline that gives you that power? For me, the extensible web manifesto is a good thing, but for some reason, rendering seemed to get a pass in that conversation, and it's not something that's been extended yet. And I think it makes the system you're more able to reason about it if you get those controls, hopefully. And it's just less magic. But if we still want magic, we could always fork the web, which is not necessarily what I think we want to do, but we could explicitly create like a web app-centric fast path and aggressively deprecate anything that just stands in our way. Why not? It's the future. I think that will be sad for the web. I actually do, and I think we don't want to see it bifurcated. I'm not convinced we need it either. But in the interests of completeness, there you have the third option. Ultimately, though, I think those are technical considerations, and we might do a balance of all those three. For me, they have to subordinate to the primary question. We have a layout pipeline that's phenomenally successful at laying out documents. But we're trying to make it amazing for web apps. And when push comes to shove, if we can't have an engine that is amazing or even good at both, what do we actually want? What do we want our engines to be default fast for? Lots of questions and perhaps not many answers. But then that's the job of the panel, isn't it? So I guess with that, I'll say thanks and suggest we get started.
Thank you, Paul. Waiting for my on slide. Make sure I get the right question. I'm pretty sure I know what the first question is. So following on to that, I mean, one of the things, big gaps we have in the performance landscape for the web is the lack of a layout benchmark. We have them for scripting, we have them for compositing and canvas and various pieces of network activity. We really don't have one for layout. I think that makes it underrepresented in the performance work that happens. So I'd like to ask you, Charles, you're in this stuff all the time. What would you put in a layout benchmark today?
Oh boy. Well, put all of Flipboard in there, and then call it a day. No, I mean, there's so many different types of apps, but you really want to get representations of each of the big apps. I would say text rendering is one of them. We do all sorts of text measurement and things like that. Something that looks like a game, something that looks like a lot of data. I mean, we could go anywhere from consumer to scientific. It's a broad, I would say I don't know the full answer. I don't know if you can actually put everything into a layout benchmark.
So actually, I want to add just a quick note for participants from the audience. If you raise your hand, we can bring a microphone to you when you sort of register yourself to speak there, and then you'll have a microphone. You'll be able to speak. So I guess actually, while we're waiting for that to get settled, I'll throw it over to Paul here. You're an advocate for developers. Benchmarks are a very effective way for developers to advocate for themselves.
They can be.
Why don't we have one?
I worry about benchmarks getting gamed, generally, but that notwithstanding, I think yes. One of the hard things is measuring smoothness is really difficult today in a cross-browser. There's no API that says, is this smooth? And a couple of days ago, a Chrome engineer posted to the web performance group saying, we think we could do with this API. And I would love to see how that conversation turns out. Because if you have that API, then you can start making meaningful benchmarks, hopefully. And I think you're right, like something that is representative of the kind of things that people are trying to make, not necessarily the things they've made in the past, but what are we trying to make now? Like infinite scrolling list views or you know, all the stuff that you guys are doing at Flipboard. Let's put that in there and let's see how fast we can get it on mobile, on desktop, everywhere. That'll be great.
Jonathan, do you have a microphone? Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to make you say something anyway. No, it's fine. No? Okay, next time. So it's true we don't have the smoothness there. Is that smoothness test rather? Is that really a limit? You know, David, you work on layout performance. How do you tell if stuff got better if you don't have a smoothness API? Can we not measure layout in some other way?
I mean, I think. I don't know. A lot of the measuring we do is still about absolute time, I think, when we're actually looking at layout itself as a very narrow thing. We are starting to have tools internally for measuring things like frame rate and so on. How do we expose? I mean, I think the conversation about how we expose those to the web is a good one, and we should have that. But
certainly from Chrome's point of view, you can load Chrome with a bunch of flags, and we use then an extra API that we use in telemetry, which is how we run through our benchmarks and go, was that faster, was that slower, and it's all automated. I think it is this question of how then do you make that something that's more broadly available in a safe way and so on. And in the right way, and make it a primitive that people can build on top of, rather than saying we need necessarily a layout benchmark. I think it is the right thing to give the underlying primitive. This is kind of the extensible web stuff, right? Just give them, and then people can build the right things. Because it's very difficult from the outside to go, well, we should make a benchmark that does exactly this one thing, or we should make this one case fast, because like I said, there's such a range. You just end up making this. We did this with scrolling, didn't we? Right? We made scrolling fast, and then all of a sudden people tried to go off-piste, and it was like, yeah, that's not going to work. You don't get scroll events. That's not going to play out nicely. And I kind of feel like that with anything that would be the smoothness benchmark. You've got to just kind of take a step back and say, what do we need to give developers so that they can start testing it themselves in the way that makes sense for their applications?
For load time, we have the page speed score. Could we have something like that, like sort of gamify the whole thing and have people go, I've got a layout time of this much, like having something of DevTools or something where you collapse the whole page, open it up, and you've got a score, like from nothing to this much is how much your page takes to lay out, paint, everything, and you could say, we reckon that's a pretty good score, or we reckon that's an awful score. Your DOM's too big, or the kind of things you're positioning are too complex. Is there something we can do so people can clearly identify when their page is good and when their page is bad?
I would love that. I think the score is like a really good first indicator of, is it good or is it bad? Hopefully you'd be able to see that from this thing not working nicely. But beyond that, it's like, if you've got something that's not playing nicely, we were talking about this last night. If you've got 3 things that aren't playing nicely and you remove one, and all of a sudden it looks like it's playing more nicely, you don't necessarily know what it was, that one thing. It could have been 3 things that weren't playing nicely together, and you remove the one that broke the condition. But you want more information, not just a score, not just a number at the end. You want to kind of know how did you arrive at that answer, so that I can make more intelligent guesses, rather than this big black box of, hey, you put some CSS and some DOM in, you get something, a number out the other side, or a frames per second. Like, let people sort of start to dive into that. It's probably a bit overwhelming, though.
Yeah, I think you need some dev tools in order to make it easier for the developers to know what's going on. So for example, like, if you're looking at a newsfeed perf, you're going to say, oh, I changed this, so I triggered a reflow or relayout, and now what? So you have a timing, but you have no idea what happened and where you should be, you should organize your code to be faster, or what happened in the layout, which elements were layout, and so we don't have this information, so we have to guess and try to test something, but it's as you said, a real black box for us.
I mean, when we profile our app, we frequently see hotspots being spent either in painting, or in layout, or in image decoding, or in compositing, and they trade places all in the same profile. And I mean, it would be great if everything was integrated together, and you could see oh, JPEG decoding was taking this long, or the gradient draw that I was doing is taking this long. We have that on the native side. When we profile our JavaScript apps, it says, well, paint took this long, and layout took this long, and you're like, where do I start?
Yeah, I mean, some of those conditions are very complicated, though, because you end up in a situation where you've done something that makes the painting process itself slow. You've done something else that makes you paint a lot. Fixing either one of those would fix your performance problem, and we need to somehow figure out how to show that information to you in a useful way, and that's kind of hard.
Yeah, I agree. I was profiling something this past week, and there were 1,000 or so elements, and they all had overflow hidden on, and layout was actually really fast. Generally speaking, layout's actually really fast, but layer management is not, or it's getting better, but it wasn't in this case. And the thing was, I turned off overflow hidden as a bit of a guess. I was like, I wonder what happens if I do this. And sure enough, layer management went down, but layout went through the roof. It went from 9 milliseconds up to 77 milliseconds. But this was looking at this, I was like, I don't know why. I have to speak to our engineers who very kindly sit with me and explain in simple terms why this is true. But it's, as a developer, you look at this, you go, I just changed one style. Everything went really weird. Now what do I do? And that's the problem I desperately want us to solve. How do we make that reasonable again?
Absolutely. Something here from Steve Souters.
In the world of performance metrics, we have these kind of 2 camps of synthetic and ROM, where ROM is real user traffic. And a lot of the things that I feel have been talked about so far is on the synthetic side, where we're collecting profiles on heavily instrumented browsers in the dev world or in a lab. And I haven't heard people talking about metrics that could be gathered on real traffic. And there was that great blog post a year or so ago from Twitter where they said, our performance metric is time to first tweet, but I forget exactly what they did, but whatever they did really wasn't exactly on when the tweet was rendered, because we have no way of measuring that via JavaScript on real pages. And so it seems like we could do a lot of things on what kind of rendering metrics we want to gather in the real world, but this is a really obvious one. I've got a key container in my page that contains the first tweet or the photo of the day or whatever, and I just want to know when it finished rendering. Is there a way that are people working on that, or what kind of real world metrics can be gathered with regard to layout?
So what we do on the iOS app is we log for each newsfeed cell how much time it takes to render. And so this way, we know on each device and all the devices how much time it renders, so we can improve it. And we also have a smoothness test where we log how many FPS do we get, how many frames do we drop, when do we drop them, what causes the drop. And this way, we can aggregate on real traffic, how much layout is costing us and how much rendering is costing us. But unfortunately, on web, there's like no real API for us to do that.
Okay, great. So I think we're going to we'll move to the next question now. Excellent. We'll move to the next question now. So most of the performance improvements that we see today are really been focused around GPU optimization, especially around rasterization and compositing, making that asynchronous or doing it in alternate hardware. Once that well is dry, or to apply to other aspects of layout performance, where do we see the next major performance improvement there? And I'll ask, I guess, David to start. What's on the menu?
I mean, in some ways, it's hard to predict. One area that could be big is parallelism, just because one of the trends with hardware these days is that you're not getting faster cores, you're getting more cores, and the web needs to figure out how to exploit that better. Things like script in the DOM, like the web sort of has the sort of single-threaded programming model of the DOM, but there are things in layout that can certainly be parallelized better. That said, we don't even necessarily know what the next thing is going to be. It could end up being other things that make things faster.
When I tested it this past week and I've spoken with people, layout itself was fast, and parallelizing that doesn't seem to me to bring us any great wins unless I'm missing something from there. I agree, though. We definitely, the thing we optimize for, is what I was trying to say at the start, is we have to optimize in the direction that people want us to go, which is, if you're trying to build web apps, we should try and make web apps fast. It's probably a really simple way to look at the world. But,
I mean, another way to improve speed is to reduce the amount of work that's being done. I mean, we have parallel core desktops, but when you look at a mobile phone, we're still at quad core, which still blows my mind, but at small numbers of cores on phones. And so one way to do that would be to give fast paths or different ways of having apps or web apps interact with the browser core. For example, the way React does a virtual DOM and batches commands and sends them to the DOM all at once, and that is an improved API. If you had some deeper integration so the browser could understand those things, right, and apps are not integrating so much.
The thing that worries me about that is this idea that you have to take everything off. It's like re-implementing the browser's everything to just do the one thing. And that just feels so alien. I think, like you say, if the deeper integration is these hooks in, so that you actually have more direct control over the parts of the pipeline, rather than having to go, I'll just do it all myself then, fine, if you want a job done properly.
Well, I think it's more of like batching up things. So for example, the way I set attributes on a DOM element is I have to call, if I want to set 10 attributes, I have to say set attribute, set attribute, set attribute, set attribute. Or I could inject HTML, which I don't know if that's even better, but if there was a command that said like send 10 attributes and set them all at once as one call, for example, some kind of improved APIs.
Could we get
Sorry,
more?
I'm going to take one from the delegates there too. Oh, I was going to. Is it Jordan? No? It's different now. Ada. Does Ada have a microphone? Oh, geez. Sorry, I thought we had somebody up there.
Is it worth having multiple optimized settings so that you could say this page is more like a web app, this page is more like a document, optimize accordingly?
Yeah. Well, I think it'd be an interesting question maybe for David, is what could developers tell you about their pages that would let you lay them out more quickly, you render them more quickly?
I mean, I think whenever there's a, no, that's too strong a statement, but there are many cases where there's things that developers could tell us that we could use to optimize in one direction or another, but we could also just do those things on our own. We can detect that you don't use this feature and optimize that way. The hard part about that is the risk is we create weird performance characteristics for the platform. In other words, if we have a mechanism where if you don't use any floats, some set of layout things are a lot faster, and then you pull in some piece of external content that has a float, and you trigger that bit. That's going to be hard to debug.
But that's already the case.
Yeah,
like if you have on wheel and you use it, then you're going to kill all the scrolling performance of in WebKit.
Yeah. OK, I want to take Larry was up and then not, and now here he is. Yes, I want to take a question from him.
I was just going to ask you to talk about the relationship of layout performance in HTTP2 with server push and prioritization, because I thought that would be a major factor of something new coming that would change how layout would perform.
I mean, I think there are a bunch of things we can do to get provide feedback from layout within the browser to better prioritize what resources we're loading. I think hopefully some of that will be happening within not too far in the future, but that's not something that I wouldn't expect things like orders of magnitude improvement out of that. But I would expect sort of better responsiveness for the sort of the first useful appearance of a page.
So I have a question. So on iOS, what we do is we render all the stories like in a different thread, and whenever they are rendered, we push them to the main thread. And unfortunately, we cannot do that on web, because in a web worker, we cannot have access to CSS. And we cannot even, I tried to re-implement like a big part of CSS, but I don't have any text measurement API. So I cannot even re-implement CSS. So is there a way for me as a developer to prepare some of the parts of the UI in a different thread and then push them back to the main thread so we don't stall?
That actually takes us, this is, I think, a good opportunity to move to the next question, which is pretty related. I'll take Dominic first, and then I want to come back to this topic because it's where we end up with the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question.
Stand up, sorry, so the camera can get you.
Hi, camera. Oh, okay. My question is, what can we learn from other operating systems and native app frameworks and so on? Like, what is the web doing that's so different that makes it so hard, or is it hard everywhere and everybody's just more professional on iOS and they're able to do their job and get 60 frames per second and we're not? Or like what is different in iOS and Windows and all these things that we could learn from?
Yeah, and we actually have a question to that I do want to sort of get to, but I sort of like to. I think that's a bigger question than we have time for in the sort of the remaining time on this topic. I want to make sure we have a bunch of time for it. So, but I do want to push in here. There was another sort of question. If we can move to the next one here. Layout's often poorly suited, as Christopher was saying, to having innovation in user space, in script space. It's hard to polyfill new layout types and so forth. What do libraries need from browsers? What are the most important primitives to expose there so we could see more of these things experimented on at the pace of script libraries rather than at the pace of browser implementation?
I think I'd be really excited just to have more hooks, like Paul was saying, into when the browser's doing things. Like, we have request animation frame, which is great to do just before paint, so we can get that at the right time. But it'd be really interesting to know even when layout has happened or when layout is about to happen. Because sometimes parts of the page might change and you just have no idea. There's no way of detecting when the parts of parts of the page changed. Because if you're doing stuff in JavaScript, some things in layout that CSS can't do, you need to be able to know, a class on the body changed, which hid this thing, and then changed the width of this, and you just have no way of knowing. Like, mutation observers don't go that far, so that's something I think would be would really enable libraries to do more.
Okay. And Alex?
To Christopher's point, I wish my colleague Elliot's friend was here. He'd do a much better job of this. Oh, is he? Well, Elliot, how about you take this about what the primitives for CSS should be?
There you go, Elliot. That was beautifully done.
I got microphone sniped. I think the biggest thing that's missing right now is text measurement, as brought up. We have no API to measure text. And that's hugely deficient, and Canvas has this really painful to use text measurement API. Anyone who's ever used it understands quite how painful it is. And I think if I was going to expand the space right now, I would like to expose the way that we break up line boxes and wrap text and measure text and text justification and glyph sizing. And I think that that goes a long way. Canvas already has the ability to draw a rectangle, but it has no way to wrap text. And that just seems like something that we should solve for you.
Yeah, the case I was talking about was actually like a component we made where we had to like dynamically fit text in a box. Like, oh, the box is this big. OK, let's shrink the text down, and like, or just using the available space. And we have to do some measurements, and there might be pieces either side of the text which change the box size, or those pieces might get hidden. And it's really hard for us to detect that. So sometimes we just have to manually, like, say, resize now. And I don't know, it gets messy. It gets really messy.
So to get back on Dominic's question, the way the browser layout works is you put your CSS, and the browser is going to do an entire layout pass on everything. And if you want to like control, so for example, for one element, you want to inside change what you want, like change the size of the inner element, you got to do a full layout pass, measure the element, update the children, and do a full layout pass. And the way it's working on iOS and on Android is for each element, you know its size, and you have to manually specify the size of the children and the size of yourself. So the API is a lot more painful, but it enables you to do like everything you want, basically. So on one side, on web, it's pretty easy. You declare what you want, and it gets done. But you don't have that fine-grained control.
In the web, in that sense, it becomes magical. And it's brilliant, because if you just want to lay out text, it will do it for you. But if you want to take control and do that yourself, there is no way, right? And this is firmly, I'll be interested to see how the extensible web one goes this afternoon, because I think that's right in that territory of, can you expose these things in such a way that if somebody was desperate to do their own text layout, they could do that. And they could also measure how long that thing took. Because that's the other aspect of this. You can go off-road, do your own thing, but you should also know the impact of doing that and what you're trading off when you take the browser's job from it and do it yourself. What does that actually then mean for you and your app?
I mean, at Flipboard, we actually do a lot of our page layout in JavaScript, and that's because we want things like baseline grids and column grids and gutters and things that just aren't available in the browser. Things like something like CSS columns, but with more things that we want specific to our application. And we struggle with things like knowing when the font loaded so we could measure it. And we have workarounds to measure text. And we get around it by saying, let's put a DOM element into the body and size it this way and then measure it. But that's really hacky. And we still don't know when the font loaded. So those are the kinds of things that we deal with. And it's top of the profile for us. Everything else we can kind of get done. But not that.
So I think Elliot's point about exposing the stuff about text measurement and breaking and wrapping and things like that, I hadn't actually heard that feedback before, and it's certainly something useful that I think is relatively doable in terms of something we can expose. I think it's also somewhat different from the idea of actually exposing the full layout model in the idea behind the Extensible Web Manifesto, which would sort of say that we want to actually expose the concepts you would need to do something like build Flexbox in an implementation that didn't already have it. That said, doing all of that is really hard because of the complexity of all the existing layout concepts that we have, and how those concepts interact with each other in a whole bunch of different ways.
So yeah, to get back on you on the trying to re-implement Flexbox, one of the big missing parts we have is you cannot polyfill it, because if you add a rule that doesn't exist in the browser, like in the DevTools, you can see it, but in JavaScript, you have no way to actually see it. So one of the great things with the browser and JavaScript is you can polyfill like all the APIs back to IE6, but in the CSS you cannot. And the people that did polyfill Flexbox, what they did, they implemented a full CSS parser and a full like CSS selector engine, and every time like something changes in the DOM, like they do the like re-implement CSS just to get Flexbox,
Yeah,
which is crazy.
I think that's the easy part, though. Like, I think we could add.
I think that's very telling.
I know, I did three this morning.
That's the easy part.
Well, no, like I think fixing that is the easy part. In that we could add an API for polyfilling CSS properties.
Please do.
And that would be an API, but that API would be much easier to add than the API for becoming part of a layout model.
Well, that's the first step.
So, Alex. Oh, sorry. Yeah. When you have a comment to raise your
I
hand.
have a question. So my question is, are we going to a future where basically the whole render tree is going to be exposed? What should be exposed to content authors and what should not? Because from my understanding, most content authors, they see layout as a black box. Like I write a CSS rule and something happens.
Yeah, this is an interesting sort of issue. Is, how much does it change the ergonomics of building a website that just works across devices and so forth? What do you think we shouldn't expose, Paul?
That's a really, I don't know what the use case is. Actually, I don't know what it is at this point that people are trying to make. Well, we know like they're trying to polyfill Flexbox, and it should be in support of use cases. It should absolutely be. We're trying to do these things. What primitives do we need to do that? I don't know what those are at this stage. I think we just need to have the conversation rather than getting to this point. As I said, rendering today has had a pass to not be part, seemingly, of the extensible web manifesto. I think that's time that we took that question and said, should this actually be exposed? That's the thing, the first question. If the answer is yes, then I think we need to have a very long and probably interesting conversation about exactly what, but I don't know what that is yet.
I want to go to Alex in 1 second, but I do want to hear very quickly from David, what is the scariest thing for you to expose to content authors, right? What would you want to fix right away?
It's kind of even, like it's hard to even know, but like there's a lot of things in layout.
I'll let you get away with that
scary.
only because I really want to hear from Alex.
Thanks. David, I'm really actually kind of shocked to hear you say that you haven't heard that feedback before, specifically because I think the folks who have been working in and around the Extensible Web Manifesto principles for the last couple of years have been focused on the idea that you need to explain yourself at a platform level when you provide capabilities at the high level. And specifically, text rendering seems like an easy one, and participating in the entire area of layout seems like the obvious next set of steps for this. And I think to the earlier question, should we expose the render tree? Well, if we can get a portable description of how browsers operate, we owe it to users to express as much of it as is safe, right? The answer of what shouldn't you expose is maybe cross-origin image readback in a case where it isn't a CORS image, right? Those are the sorts of areas where there are security implications for some of these compositional features of the web that we can't break. But in every other area, I challenge you differently and suggest that we should be exposing everything that the browser can do to the extent that it's possible.
So I kind of have two different responses to that. But I think there are a few ways where layout is a little bit different in that a bunch of the technology behind style and layout was sort of designed with things like device independence and being able to adapt to different sorts of devices, being able to adapt to different user preferences as sort of a fundamental characteristic of those technologies. I think, like, if we had had these capabilities before the iPhone, people would have done things that would have made it a lot harder for the iPhone to adapt desktop web content to mobile. So I think, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but I'm saying I think we need to be careful and try and do it in a way that doesn't break those aspects of the way these technologies are designed.
Okay. Oh. Very quickly.
At some level, I don't accept your argument, because the same is said for DOM. So for instance, the argument is that if we had exposed what it means to participate in the form system to the extent that you could create a custom element, which is a true input box, then iOS couldn't have styled the select element the way it did. Right? This is both misdirection and roughly untrue. It is the case today that people already have very large JavaScript frameworks that re-implement large portions of this stuff, and that content, yes, didn't port. But developers have strong incentives to do the things that are cheap and free in the platform, and those are the things that we can adapt. But it's when developers get stuck that they need the flexibility. And they're not asking for it because they don't want you to adapt for them. They're asking for it because you haven't adapted well enough for them for the new context that they already find themselves in. It's not about the backward-looking scenario. It's about the forward-looking scenario where you're not already ahead. And the argument behind the Extensible Web Manifesto is that you're not going to be ahead. I can't predict the future, and I know that you're probably better than me at this, but I also have a reason to doubt.
Thank you. So we move on to the next question here. Sort of in the similar vein, a lot of the hardest things to do smoothly involve tracking the human input, where that feedback cycle needs to be very, very tight, and going through our current abstractions can be a big problem. What are the missing declarative or shortcut pieces that would get us in shorter order to really responsive and smooth layout while we're resolving some of these bigger issues? You, Charles, what would you like to see as a way to just say, track this or give me fast feedback on this for the kinds of apps you're building at Flipboard?
I'll say that a lot of what we've done in the past to make performance even on native track well with good latency has been to rasterize things, shove them in images, and then show these images as facades and let the user interact with them. Browsers do that by rendering web content into tiled images and then show the user the images. If we had more control to be able to render content and control how those facades are presented to the user, we could give a lot more smoothness to the user without saying to the browsers we need every little ounce of performance you can give us. We can fake things. If we have the ability to fake things, we can put band-aids around things.
I'm just curious, how does that differ from, say, having a canvas where you can rasterize and take control of rasterization yourself?
So in Flipboard, we have this page flip animation where we cut the page in half and we flip it down like this. So the way we do that is we render the entire page into an image, and then we split it apart in the scene graph on the native side. Okay. And yes, I could re-implement CSS and HTML and render everything in. That's been done before, but it's not ideal. And so what we actually do is we clone the node and we animate the two halves in two different DOMs. That's also really scary too.
I guess the reason I'm asking is because if you were so inclined, you could take WebGL and 3JS, and you could have a scene graph, and you could chuck it in an image as a texture and have it do the 3D thing.
You get to re-implement everything if you do that.
But we have all text rendering and all text layout as well.
And CSS.
Okay, so you want we want the goodies of the ease of doing the web thing,
right,
without having to re-implement. Okay,
right,
fine.
And we had this with Translate Z0 hack, but unfortunately, Chrome is not guaranteeing that it's going to be in a layer. So we have no guarantee that everything that's going to be inside of this animation is not going to blow up and relay out while you're doing anything, which is very scary.
We have from the audience here, Dominic.
Okay, so speaking to this question in particular about touch and easy shortcuts that we can do, 'cause I think this is really interesting because there's competing instincts people have on the browser side. Some of them are we should make touch events really low level, and we should make it give you hooks into before scroll that are synchronous, and then you can, if you're really careful and you code really well, you can get 60 FPS and complete control. Whereas some of the other ideas that I think are really, really interesting and I want to see more of are what if we made gestures or scrolling a timing, a timeline that you could hook up into web animations. So you could say, I want this animation to be controlled by how the user is scrolling or how they're gesturing. And that, to me, when you think of shortcuts that would make these things easier and also fast, that I think is one of the most interesting ideas I've seen. And I'm not really sure if people are into it, but I wanted to put it out there in case people hadn't heard of it.
Yeah, I think that the thing to connect animation timelines to scrolling is a good idea, and I think there's proposals for it for I think web animations and for CSS animations, and I think a lot of people are pretty excited about that.
Yeah, this is looking at some of the web VR stuff that's being mooted right now. I mean, one of the big issues in VR is the very low latency between motion to photon to avoid sim sickness and so forth. So if that's something we can do in a programmatic way, that's great, but is it a case where are there going to be cases where we need to punch through those abstractions for really purpose-built stuff? We
have a history of punching through for scrolling, and it's great for that use case, but the moment you step off that path, you're in trouble. You're in a lot of trouble, and there's no way back out. And so when somebody says shortcut, it's like, for me, the caveat has to be, but it's a recreatable shortcut, like with underpinning
and a
primitives.
smooth gradient of performance, ideally, rather than some discontinuity.
Otherwise it's unreasonable, because it's magic, again.
Great. Tobias is, if you have something to add, and I hope lots of people do, if you can raise your hand when you add yourself to the list, then we can get the microphone to you early and so forth.
Yeah, so sorry, it's not related to that question now, but so regarding a fast path in the browser where you say, well, I want to limit myself to, let's say, Flexbox or something, because I know the browser is faster there. How about we give the user control of like searching this, and whenever you use something else, it gives you an error. Like then you couldn't even use it, and you wouldn't know if there's something that would trigger the slow path. What's the problem with that, or is that?
Could you repeat? I didn't really get the last bit.
And then you mean to provide sort of a strict mode that,
yes,
that pages can opt into a smaller surface of the web platform,
yes,
and they just error out if they touch the wrong things?
Yes, right.
Okay.
That sounds like a good idea to me, but David said like vendors can already kind of predict what features you're going to be using by just seeing what properties you're...
It's not that we can predict, but if there's some great thing we can do, we could already just count whether you're doing it or not and optimize based on that. But the point he's making is that he wants to ensure that he doesn't fall off that fast path. I think we could do that sort of thing. When you say error, people have different interpretations of error. I think we don't want the yellow screen of death. For those of you who are familiar with XML parse errors. But we could take a route where you opt into having a feature not work, where not work means silently fail in some way.
Okay. Wouldn't that ruin the debug aspects? Where you go, I think this should work, but again, it magically doesn't work now. Or it feels like it's because maybe you include a web component that switched something off or didn't expect something. Like that idea that you're not always you're not always in control of every part of the page, and that feels like it would work in the context where you are. That would be a concern that you don't have the final say. Or if you switch something on, you say, don't ever switch this off, and something that you need to use needs to switch it off. We're in a very horrible place.
Yeah, it doesn't really work when you're using third-party scripts and stuff. You have no idea what APIs they're using, and you might be like, oh, I don't need InnoxDB, I'm going to turn it off, and then...
Well, you have a manifest. Yeah. No, sorry, I don't want to borrow that talk. Sorry, I want to move on to... I actually want to skip a couple questions because we only have time for one more, I think, and I want to go back to something Dominic raised earlier, which is that native toolkits provide a ton of help for doing smooth layout and smooth interactions. What do we need to borrow from that, and where is the web where can we just copy our way to victory in some of these cases? So I know, I mean, on the Flipboard side, you deal with a bunch of native pieces and you deal with a bunch of web stuff. What do you miss most in terms of the performance and layout characteristics when you come back to the web?
I think for us most, we probably miss improved text manipulation primitives. I mean, more broadly, I would say things that are missing are a pure way to get to render things into a texture and show that. We know that the security has security implications if I were to render the bank header in the browser Chrome on the screen. But having that kind of behavior allows us to improve a lot of paths in the application. And just more generally at previous companies, we've adopted Flash-like scene graphs with shaders and things that run very fast directly, that touch the hardware very, very closely, and having something like core animation or some other type of scene graph would help with a lot of animation cases that we run into.
And so, I mean, you on the Firefox OS side, Wilson, I mean, you're trying to build stuff that's experientially competitive with those other platforms, right? You're really going head to head with them. What is hard for you there? What do you go and stand over David's desk and bang on it for?
I don't know. Well, at the moment, like tooling, we just need tooling. We need to know where we're spending time. There's always this like pressure to like no regressions, startup time must be as fast as possible, blah blah blah. But sometimes it's tricky to know, exactly what's happening unless you're a Gecko like expert. It's very hard to know what exactly where exactly I'm spending my time and how I should be laying out the page differently. So like there's a few people at Mozilla who know rendering really, really well, and they can just look at the display lists and just say, oh yeah, clearly you're using this element looks a bit strange to me in like a list of 1,000 elements, and like I'd really like just more tooling to surface these faux pas, like to make things easier.
I think when I look at this, I think things like Polymer and web components hopefully helps there, where like accepted good ways to do things can start to be shared with other people. So if somebody makes a phenomenal infinite scrolling list, that can be shared, that can be built upon, and that includes baked into it the fast path, the idea of how you should do these kinds of things.
Yeah,
so that if you want to do your own thing, you still can, because that fast path, and maybe we need to build down a bit, like we're saying with these extra hooks, to do those really well. But you've got it in both directions now. You've got a kind of an example that you can take and hopefully configure, and you've got also the underlying ways of redoing that thing yourself, rather than kind of hoping that you can recreate it. I think that's what we need, and hopefully that fast tracks a lot of people who are like, I need to make a web app. It's got to have these features. Why don't I just use that thing that is already shipped and good?
Yeah, that's the most exciting thing for me, that we can actually start sharing these pieces, and someone who doesn't know that much about performance and all the things you need to know to get like a well-performing app can just take a piece off the shelf and just use it, and suddenly they've got something that's performing as well as native. And that's something the web's never had before. Like yeah, you could maybe, if you were using the same library as someone else, you might be able to use a component that they built. But the fact that we have it built into the platform now is like super exciting. And I think for us in Firebox OS, like we're really going to see, we're banking on web components to really accelerate the number of apps that are going to land in the marketplace. If we can just give developers a package and just say, look, here you go, like you can build an app in a day, like to get that, and that's something that I think we're going to really, really start.
You raised the issue too of needing to be, not needing to have a lot of web expertise in order to make a high-performance web app. But I think, you're on iOS, you need to work relatively hard to make something that's janky. So it feels like we're really kind of at the wrong ends of that there. We're at the end of our time as well, unfortunately. So I do want to thank the panel and everybody that contributed to this. I think layout performance is an area we need to see a lot of attention to in the future if we're going to take web apps to the next area. So thanks all a lot for your participation.